afternoon and welcome. So happy to join you this Thursday afternoon for Secrets of the Nervous System. Thanks to those of you who are there and joining me live today. If you want to type in the chat box hashtag live, I would love to know if you're with me. And if you're catching us on the replay later, either on Facebook or on YouTube, give me a hashtag replay so I can know when people are checking in with this. So I'm really excited. Last week we kind of did our introduction, just kind of an overview of what our 4 weeks were going to be about. And today I'm really excited that we're going to be jumping into all of that anatomy of the nervous system. So those of you who know me will know that I am an anatomy nerd. I taught gross anatomy as a tutor for several years when I was finishing my doctoral degree. And so I spent lots and lots of time in the gross anatomy lab, helping students figure out all the pieces and parts of the body. We are so lucky to have donor bodies from the Oregon Health Sciences and University. And, that was such an amazing experience, and I'm really thankful for that. And, that allowed me to be able to see some of these structures that I'm going to be talking about today of the nervous system hands-on, see what the brain really looks like, follow all of the nerves as they travel throughout the body, and really get an understanding for what those bits and pieces of the nervous system tissue really looked like, how big they were, how small they were, in a lot of instances. So I'm really excited to share that with you today. So I want to just kind of jump right in and start talking that, there's a couple of basic divisions to your nervous system. There's your central nervous system, which is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. And then there's your peripheral nervous system. So it's out on the edges, right? And that's your spinal nerves and your peripheral nerves. And so I think most people, when they think nervous system, they probably think brain, and your brain is in your cranial vault, right? And for the average person, the brain itself weighs anywhere from 2.5 to 3 pounds or so. And it's encased, like I said, in the really strong, thick bones of the cranium. And something that I talk to a lot of patients about, especially because I do a technique called cranial sacral, which affects nervous system tissue, is that the bones of the cranial vault are not fused together. They're actually like very fine teeth of a comb coming together. And so there's a little bit of play there, which is a great thing, right? Because if your blood pressure goes up, let's say you are running outside to catch something that's blowing away. Today is a really windy, blustery day, and you want to go and catch that. Then you want your cranial bones to be able to accommodate the fact that your blood pressure went up, right? Because if it didn't, and you had just the edge of the bone, and then you had soft nervous system tissue, and your blood pressure increased, then soft nervous system tissue is smashing into hard bone. That would not be so great for your brain, right? So it's good that those cranial bones have a little bit of wiggle. They're called a Wormian joint. So, your brain is made up of 3 parts: your cerebral cortex, your cerebellum, and your brainstem, and we're going to go over those in just a second. And it's covered by this tough connective tissue called your meninges. The outermost layer is the toughest part. It's called your dura mater, which means tough mother in Latin. And that really starts to form your blood-brain barrier. Most people are familiar with that. And so deeper to that, so we're going from outermost layer, so we have bone, right? And then we have dura mater. Then next layer, we have arachnoid matter. So if you've heard of like a subarachnoid hemorrhage, if you've had a head injury before, that's not good. That's bleeding between those 2 layers, right? And then the innermost layer that's really right on the surface of the brain itself is the pia mater, which is just another connective tissue layer. Your brain itself as a living tissue is a very soft gel-like substance. So you can think like tofu, or, if you've been to that Halloween party where someone had that, bowl of different types of foods and you were supposed to go around and touch it with your eyes closed, and someone had Jell-O and they said, oh, that's like a brain. it really is kind of true. That's what your connective tissue is, right? And that's why it's also so important to protect your head, because if that is moving around and being impacted, it's really easy to damage and cause injury to that tissue that can take a while to recover from, right? So your cerebrum is the biggest part of your brain, and it's divided into symmetrical right and left halves. Your right side, you know, colloquially, anecdotally, tends to be your more like abstract, artistic, associative side. Left side tends to be maybe more logical, pattern recognition, concrete, black or white type of thing. Of course, that's not true for everybody, and it's not true in all cases. There definitely are functions that are more on the right side, more on the left side. And your cerebrum itself is made up of some different lobes. So, you know, different lobes of your brain that help you with different functions. So there's the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. So your frontal lobe sits right here at the front of your brain. And it really is those reasoning, logic, higher cognitive function tasks. That's the part of your brain that really does that. And that's also the newest part of your brain. If you go back and watch last week's video, we kind of talked about that a little bit in terms of like order of development, and also how soon and well those functions come online as kids develop. So your frontal lobe is kind of that area that takes a little bit longer to develop and really come online. Your occipital lobe is kind of back here, and that's your visual systems, among other things. Temporal lobe here on the side is auditory. Big surprise, it's right by your ears, right? And then your parietal lobe is kind of deeper in there. And that really houses a lot of functions that are your somatosensory functions, which means, you know, sensing what your body is picking up from your environment. So your cortex is divided into two main functional areas, motor and sensory, right? So motor, making your body move around, sensing, like I said, what your environment is giving. And then association areas that help you kind of coordinate thought and decisions and perception. So then deeper to that, as we're going down, so a lot of times when we're thinking about anatomy, we start at the top and we work our way down. So that's how I'm presenting this to you today. So we're starting with like the cerebral cortex that's there, you know, those lobes, and then we're working our way down. So underneath that, we have our cerebellum, which looks like a little mini brain sitting underneath the main big part of those two hemispheres. And your cerebellum is really important for your sense of balance, coordination, making complex movements smooth and fluid. So your cerebellum is really important for a lot of different functions. And, you know, if you're familiar with recognizing signs of a stroke, like fast, coordinated movements can be one of the things that you're looking for, because oftentimes in a stroke, your cerebellum is really impacted and affected because of the arteries that tend to be affected most in those. And so following down from that, if we keep going down, we have our brain stem, right? And so I want to leave this diagram up on here for just a second. Oh, I'm going to go back to that because you can see the different parts of our brainstem and how it's kind of stacked on top of each other. And that coordinates, like we talked about last week, many of the unconscious body functions that we need to live and survive, like breathing, heart rate, eye movement, balance. You know, 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves come directly off of your brainstem. And it's also kind of, you can think of it as like a switching board for the rest of the brain, relaying information from the spinal cord to higher brain centers and then back and forth. So as we continue in our survey going further south towards your feet, we come upon your spinal cord, which is exiting off the end of the brainstem at the foramen magnum, so right up here at the base of your neck. And your spinal cord is a really important structure, right? It's long. It's about 17 to 18 inches in the adult person. It's, like I said, starts way up here at the brainstem, and then it goes to the upper lumbar spine and ends at about L2 for most people. Interesting, it stops growing when you're about 4 years old. And so that means that of the total length of your vertebral canal in your spine, it really is only taking about 2/3 of the available space there. When it ends in your low back, it terminates into the filum terminale, and then there's a little piece of connective tissue that goes down and inserts into your coccyx. And so that's what makes it possible for you. You might have heard of a spinal puncture or spinal tap, because there's a little space down at the bottom where there isn't really any nerve tissue to puncture with a needle, but there is cerebral spinal fluid, which we'll get to in just a minute, and talking about that important tissue is part of your nervous system. So your spinal cord, think of it as like that main highway that's connecting your brain and the peripheral nervous system, which we're going to go back and talk about in just a second. So it's transmitting nerve signals from the motor cortex and sensing fibers to sensory neurons and to the sensory cortex. Your nervous system also coordinates lots of reflexes and does so many important things. So if there's problems, I mean, you know, if there's problems with your spinal cord, there's problems with your whole nervous system. So, you know, as we continue going off, now we're going to talk about like what's happening as it's coming off the spinal cord. So I'm going to go back to a little video clip. I mean, you can see right coming off the sides there's all those little nerve rootlets that come together that then form spinal nerves. So they're coming directly off the edges of your spinal cord, right? And so technically they are considered part of your peripheral nervous system, because your central nervous system is really just the brain and spinal cord. So your spinal nerves, there's a pair, so one sensory and one motor nerve on each side that are coming off and merging and coming and making 31 different spinal nerves as you're going down. And that correlates with 31 different spinal cord segments on right and left sides. And so that goes along with the different segments of your spine. So you have cervical nerve roots, you have thoracic nerve roots, you have lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. So you have the most in your thoracic spine, you have 12 there. It's interesting, so you only have 7 bones in your cervical vertebra region, but you actually have 8 pairs of spinal nerve rootlets that come off there, just because of how, you know, the numbering works out. So then as we branch off from those spinal nerves, we have peripheral nerves. And they, you know, incorporate both motor function, so muscle control, as well as sensory things. So we're sensing the environment and then responding to it. So a great example of this is your brachial plexus here that comes off of your cervical spine and your neck. And it actually looks like a hand. That's how I often describe it to patients, is that it looks like a hand and then it comes out and it forms all the nerves that control the rest of your arm and hand. And, you know, there's great mnemonics. If you're a student of anatomy, like I have been for many, many years, there's many ways to memorize all the different nerve structures in the body. And that can be a fun test for yourself of how many you can remember, and where they all come from and where they're going back to in the spinal cord, and then where they synapse further up in the brain. So, you know, there's so many nerve endings in our body and in how it functions. And it's really, I think, helpful to understand like these basic pieces and parts of it, so that if there's a problem, we can trace back where the problem is. Because a lot of times it's not where the pain is or where the numbness is or where you think the problem is. It might be further up the chain, and the nervous system can really help us figure that out. So the last piece and part, there's 2 more things that I want to go over, and then we'll wrap up. I appreciate you all being with me here for so long this afternoon. So I wanted to take a second, like I said, and talk about cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, because it's a really key component to how your nervous system is able to function. So it's a clear fluid that's circulating throughout the brain. It's actually formed by specialized cells within the ventricle. So there's little empty spaces inside your brain. Everybody has a little bit of an empty head. Haha. So CSF is made, you know, produced inside the brain, and then it's circulated throughout the brain and then all the way down to the end of the spinal cord, and then it's recycled. Think about it as a delivery system. It helps deliver nutrients. You know, your brain is one of the most energy demanding organs in your body. Think about that. Like if you have had a hard night of sleep and you're maybe not eating so great, you don't think so clearly, right? Like your reaction time for like grabbing something is slower. Maybe you don't stop at the stoplight as fast as you want to. You might not be able to think of the word that you want to say to the person in answer to their question. And so CSF really helps some of that stuff float away. And it also is the garbage dump, right? Like it's the garbage system for taking waste away from your nervous system. Because there's so much cell overturn, then there's lots of waste products that are produced. So we have within the brain, and part of the CSF is called the glymphatic system that really is active at night. And so that's why sleep is, again, so important. And also there's some research, kind of conflicting data about like sleep position, as some sleep positions are more optimal to help drain your brain and improve flow through that glymphatic system and have turnover of CSF. CSF, interestingly, because it's produced, it's constantly being absorbed and regenerated and, circulating. It's replaced about every 5 hours or so. It has its own pulse. Just like you can feel your respiration rate, just like you can check and see, what your heart rate is, it has its own pulse. And so, especially in a technique like cranial sacral, you want to be checking for the CSF pulse rate, because if it's low from like a typical, or if it's high from a typical, that can really indicate that there's dysfunction in the nervous system, and especially in the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. And that a technique like cranial sacral can really assist in resetting some of that cranial flow and that cranial rhythm and the CSF pulse, and make a difference. And cranial sacral is an amazing technique that I really love, especially for children and babies, because it is so gentle. It's about the same pressure that you would use to touch your eye if your eye was feeling strange, or to check a tomato. Is placed on different parts of the head. If you're interested in hearing more about cranial sacral, please leave me a comment in the comments box, because I could certainly do a whole nother long talk about cranial sacral and how wonderful it is. So the last little bit that I wanted to talk about in terms of how the nervous system functions is the fact that your brain is made up of billions and billions of neurons. There's about 86 billion neurons in the average adult brain. And interestingly, we were talking about the different parts of, your brain, and that we have the cerebrum, we have the cerebellum, and we have the brainstem. 19% of those 86 billion are in the cerebral cortex, which is, up here. 80% of those neurons are in your cerebellum. So does that make you think that maybe your body really prioritizes your balance and figuring out where you are in space? That a lot of what your nervous system is doing is helping you be upright and moving through the world smoothly. And that why it can be so devastating if there's a problem with your cerebellum. So a neuron, a really basic definition of what a neuron is that it's an electrically excitable cell that communicates with other cells via synapses. So where they kind of come together, they aren't actually touching, right? Like they're close enough to each other that one side releases a neurotransmitter and the other side receives it, and then it passes the message along. And so it's important to understand that our body is an electrical chemical system. A lot of mainstream medicine wants to just focus on the chemical side of things. And so that's, take this pill to, correct that imbalance. And they forget about the electrical part of it, which is where, some of my concern for patients, especially kids, with using electronic devices that are emitting, frequencies that we haven't studied super well, how that affects our nervous system. We just don't have good data about that. And we need to remember that our body functions as an electrochemical system. Like your heart beats because of electrical impact, right? Like you would use the paddles to shock someone back into a proper rhythm so their heart can beat the correct way. Your nervous system works very similarly. We need correct electrical signaling for your nervous system to function. Our sensory neurons, so there's different types of neurons, right? So we have sensory neurons that respond to stimuli like touch, sound, or light. And then we have motor neurons that receive signals from the brain to control everything like muscle contractions and, how much glands are excreting in terms of what hormones we need. And those signals, between the synapses, like I was talking about, one side sending neurotransmitter, one side receiving, that can be excitatory, so turn something on, turn it up, have more of an effect, or it can be inhibitory, kind of turn it off or turn it down. And then there's all kinds of support cells called glial cells that are also really important, micro parts of the brain in terms of anatomy. So now we're talking at level that you need a microscope to see, right? So the other parts that we talked about, your cerebrum, brainstem, cerebellum, spinal cord, peripheral nerves, all of those can be seen with the naked eye, right? Like I saw those in my gross anatomy lab. To see neurons, to see glial cells, to see any of these other things, you need to have a microscope and be able to see those at a really small level. So glial cells are, there's several different types. There's astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia. Most of those are support cells that help facilitate passage of messages through and between neurons. They're also super important. If you've ever heard of like an astrocytoma in terms of like a brain tumor, that can be a really severe, diagnosis, whereas other types of brain tumors, maybe not so much. And that tells you how important those glial cells types are to how your brain really functions and how your nervous system really functions. The other important cellular portion of neuroanatomy are mast cells, which are a specific type of white blood cells that help and interact, making that your neuroimmune system function. And that's especially true in those meningeal layers that we talked about at the very beginning of the video, the dura mater, the subarachnoid layer, and the pia mater. And that really helps your blood-brain barrier function the way that it's supposed to. And so if there's problems with your mast cell excitability, or if they're not functioning super well, that can have a direct effect on your nervous system. And so we are going to talk about that a little bit more in week 4 in the top 3 reasons why your nervous system has dysfunction. And mast cell overexcitement and kind of not functioning properly can be a big one of those. So I hope that that gives you a little bit more of a, nuts and bolts, pieces and parts kind of take on the nervous system. You could spend, and I have spent, years studying neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. And there are some people, applause to them, who spend their entire professional career studying this. So for me to talk about it in 25 minutes and distill it down to this, please understand that we are just like scratching the surface and giving just such a very basic overview of this. If there's anything that you heard me talk about that you're like, I want to know more about that, or I have a question about how this works, or why is that important, please leave a comment or send me a private message. I am happy to talk about this. As you can tell, like, I am a student of the body. I am fascinated endlessly by how the pieces and parts work and how they don't work and how we can optimize their function. So I love that you were here with me today. Thank you so much for your time. Again, if you're catching this on the replay, please leave me a comment below. My goal is that I'm just sharing some of this knowledge so that you can have a better understanding of how your body works and what to do when it isn't working the way that you want. And so however I can help facilitate that, I am more than happy to do so. Please reach out to me. I love interacting with people, and I'm happy to share all of the knowledge that I have. So I will see you again here next Thursday when we're going to be talking about the sympathetic nervous system. And also I have some freebies that I'm going to be talking about in next week's broadcast. So make sure that you tune in for that. So you have some tools in your toolbox and how to optimize your nervous system. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk with you next week.